I spend the rest of this year alone? When I can go therapy.
Sorry, I'm like, this is you're not the first person I've talked to, but yeah, I'm nervous. I'm excited. I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, because who better to talk about oppression in therapy than a straight, cisgendered white male? Like, I was going through your list of things, and I'm like, that one's me. So's that one. All but one of these are me.
I know. I was like, this is gonna be funny. I'm like, two white people talking about privilege, but at the same time, maybe it'll be encouraging to other white providers or white people, or how, to start talking about these things and recognizing the groups that they belong to.
Yes, or it's going to include a lot of microaggressions that neither one of us recognize.
Oh my gosh. I was talking to somebody and I realized, because I'm always talking about privilege, but then I was like, oh my God, within talking about privilege, I started to recognize some of my own microaggressions. And I was like, oh, this is such a long, painful journey.
Absolutely. Yes.
So you got to look at I'm going to pull it up right now for me. Yeah. So I want to describe it. It's not a long one. I have a worksheet that's actually much longer than this, and it includes like veteran status and all kinds of different privileged, non-privileged, or dominant, non-dominant groups. So this one's a lot shorter, and it includes age, physical and mental abilities, religion and spirituality, ethnic and racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, gender, and size, weight.
Yes.
All right. And I just realized I was talking to someone else, and they talked about, even for men, like how height has to do with how they're treated. And I was like, this is deep.
Totally.
Yeah. And they were like, there's like a lot of research on how short males get paid less than tall males. I'm like, yep. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's something where the average male in America is 5'7", and most of us consider that short. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that 6 foot mark for men is where they end up in more leadership roles. They end up being more attractive just based on height.
Wow. I believe it though, because it's true. Like, you stand next to somebody who's taller, they kind of command presence, even if they're not demanding presence, just because of the literal space that they take up.
Right.
Yeah. So, Curt, what kind of, I know you said you went through these and you were like, so I'm wondering what do you identify as?
So I'm a white, middle-aged, cisgendered, able-bodied European American. I fall towards the upper middle class end of things, especially on national scale sorts of income sorts of things. Heterosexual. I was born in the U.S. I'm a little on the larger side. The one though that really doesn't that I was surprised is you put on the non-dominant group. I was raised Catholic. And I was noticing also within the non-dominant group that you did not put in atheist or agnostic.
Oh, you got me.
So
I called out my own. Yeah, I would have not even recognized it, but that is totally that's totally something that's a bias of mine.
Well, and I've worked in enough space and tried to really address enough, intersectionality, representation of diverse groups. And I'll be the first to say that we're always missing something, that no matter how much effort that we put in, usually somebody's going to identify something that is missing. And so I don't say this in kind of an accusatory way. It was just kind of, hey, next time let's consider this in here too, because I do sense a growing divide between the very spiritual and the very secular as far as how that affects their ability to fit into communities and to really be able to hold their spaces. And especially in the context of talking about therapies, I really love when therapists identify themselves as, I'm a Christian therapist, or I'm a Jewish therapist who really works through this framework, because I think it does help those clients who either strongly identify or on the other side really strongly want to shy away from that, to have a power of choice and being able to get the kind of services that they want.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It does both. When we identify and we explain who we are, it gives clients, one, the opportunity to work with us, and two, the opportunity to decide not to work with us, which I think is important.
Right. And I have a colleague who moved from California to not quite rural Texas, but not in one of the major cities. And she was describing advertising her practice and getting clients because her website didn't include the words Christian-based therapy. And nothing that was wrong with that. It was just that the clients were describing that that's what the vast majority of the therapists in the area were identifying their services as. And it was refreshing to have that opportunity to be in a space that wasn't, and like I said, this is something where I think it's a fantastic idea to identify where you're coming from. So that way it's owning the direction that you go, owning your biases, whether they're positive or negative, and really allowing for that to be part of the therapeutic alliance and allowing clients to have that choice and that say in what their services are going to be.
Yeah. I was going to say, this is great. I'm looking at it right now. And also if you were to go through this with a client, and as a therapist, they call you out like, hey, this is not on here. What do you think as a therapist, how would you deal with that?
So what I've really learned is from my intake paperwork, I tried to let people fill in the blanks as opposed to providing options. And so this way it's allowing things to really be in the context of how clients identify and everything. It's being able to have a very low-key sort of first message of, I'm going to be accepting of how you identify yourself, and not really put something like gender into a binary sort of choice, but to really just have gender and a line, and whatever you put in there is going to be respected.
Is great. Yeah, no drop down, no bubbles, no fit into my box.
Right. And so this is something that I first learned in, especially working with therapists from the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ plus, if I'm really being sensitive to the nature of this conversation, but really not forcing binary choices onto clients helps us to really empower them to take ownership on their own terms of how they're going to reveal themselves and how they're going to bring themselves into therapy and into the room.
Yeah, and I'm thinking even for our clients who aren't really sure, right, to fill in the box with, I don't know,
Sure.
if it needs to be that. Yes. So I'm looking at this and I figure I will go through, let's see, I'm going to say I'm young. I'm young. I mean, by young, I'm not old. I'm able-bodied mostly. Oh, well, I guess, I don't know. I'm reading this and I'm seeing non-disabled, and I think a lot of people are thinking able-bodied as in I'm not in a wheelchair. But I do suffer from some pretty significant diseases, and I do have post-traumatic stress disorder, but they're not visible things. And I wonder, do you think some of them, if we left it blank, that clients wouldn't even identify that they belong to those groups? Like,
absolutely. And I think that this really comes from, and it's very rich clinical information, but I have worked with clients in the past who have something like very, very low grade cerebral palsy. And one of the primary mental health diagnostics that comes along with people's cerebral palsy is depression. And the reason for this is there is, especially on the higher functioning end of the physical diagnosis there's so much effort throughout their lives to fit in with people who are completely able-bodied. And there becomes so many decisions during the day of, do I ignore my limitations and try to fit in, or do I really have this invisible sort of disability come into play that affects me? And a lot of, especially kids, middle schoolers, struggle into this. And so it really creates this dichotomous thinking of either I'm a success or I'm an absolute failure. And when they run into those limitations, I see a lot of times that they ignore identifying with their physical diagnosis because they want to fit in. And so you can see just the treatment plan unfolding with this kind of a discussion, because it's, coming into the acceptance of where they are and what they're capable of doing, how that might fit in with physical therapy or some sort of occupational therapy that is a necessary part of being able to navigate the physical world. But especially early on, when people are first approaching therapy, if they're in this mindset already, I can totally see them not identifying in this way. Another area that I kind of see this in is people who might be leaving the military for what would be considered a military sort of disability. But, these are strong, able-bodied people who have, a pinched nerve in their back that allows, doesn't allow them to work in their capacity anymore. And so they might be physically handicapped, 80, 90% from military service, but seeing them walk around and being physical, manly men or women, or, doing their thing, that they might not necessarily identify this as something that's important to bring into therapy.
Yeah. And that brings a good point. Like military and veterans, there are a lot of assumptions that people make about them, and I think it's really difficult for them when they are reintegrating into like the civilian world to learn how to connect with people who aren't military or veterans. And we see that even as therapists, when a lot of veterans don't want to go into therapy because the therapists themselves are not veterans. And so there's a belief that we can't anywhere understand what they've experienced because we've never experienced it, which obviously partly true, right? I can never understand what it's like to be in war, but there is that feeling like I need to be well or look well or identify as well because the rest of the world doesn't understand my experience.
And you see this with certain populations. And another one that I just became familiar with is aviation professionals too, where admitting you saw this too. And it's just, yeah, like when the entire culture of what your work is not showing any sort of weakness, because that means that you're not going to be allowed to perform your job tasks, and your way of living is going to get in the way of your job, that there becomes this culture of needing to hide and minimize what your emotional and what your social reactions are for fear of being punished. And so it becomes this culture of needing to hide away the negative things because of the fear that a superior is going to make a decision that adversely affects your job.
And I can imagine, what does that lead to? We know that hiding your feelings and your emotions, your identity, it's going to lead down the path of like substance abuse, like all the different coping issues that really lead to the problems, like even more problems.
Right. And, the chronic stress, and, this is, I'm thinking that the 2019 version of just therapeutic discussions is at some point you have to weave in talking about the body keeps the score.
Oh yeah.
That's, this is where that chronic stress really does start to come up. And it's being able to identify what the, again, intersectionality of a person's sociocultural identity and upbringing really affects them in being able to be forthcoming about these decisions. Because I even noticed this in discussing this with my non-therapist friends, of just how easily, I work in this emotional space, in this emotional world all the time, and weave it into my everyday conversation. And my friends are just like, okay, so yeah, that's feelings, and just kind of diverge away from it because they're not in
You still have
necessarily.
friends, Curt?
I do have some friends that are outside our field, but it's really curious of just how easy it is for us to turn to, our therapist friends and just be like, I'm having a really rough day and I just need somebody to listen to me and just kind of vent for a little bit. And our therapist friends are just like, okay. And our other friends are just kind of like, go get a therapist or something.
Or aren't you a therapist?
Right, exactly. And so but again, this is even understanding, like, the culture that we live in makes talking about feelings okay. And, this is maybe something else to really consider on this list, just that occupational sort of end of just like, therapist, typically you're going to need some feelings to like go through things.
Yeah, and it reminds me, and I've seen this being posted across a lot of different social media groups that I'm in, is this idea of therapists needing support and being there's almost a fear, like, why aren't we banding together to deal with our feelings and how difficult our jobs are? And especially community therapists are really struggling in that space of, how do I reach out without being looked at as little, as less,
as harming clients. And this is a big part of a lot of the advocacy work that I do with Katie Vernoy, and really looking at our workforce issues and taking care of therapists, and therapists having a responsibility to each other and to the profession of being welcoming and encouraging and supporting. Now, there are people who probably shouldn't be therapists because of not being able to regulate and take care of themselves. But our systems should not be further harming therapists and traumatizing them and really falling into this hierarchical abuse system that fosters burnout and doesn't encourage people to seek out help. Because even within our own systems and agencies, when we say, hey, I need some help, I'm overwhelmed, then it's, well, when are you going to be able to meet your productivity standards? When are you going to be able to get back out there? Not, let's get you the support that you need.
Yeah. You know what happened? Once I was a newer therapist working community mental health, and you triggered this memory. And I had a client, and I've always really enjoyed working with like high trauma clients, like the high risk populations. And so I was sitting very early on in my therapy career with a client who pretty much was me, right? Like, I was sitting across from myself, and it hit a chord. Like, I don't know, I was probably like 22. It hit something in me. And so I had a vicarious trauma response for sure. I started having nightmares. And so when I brought it into supervision, that what they did was they removed from my caseload. So any trauma on my caseload, they removed it. I felt shamed, right? Like, I'm not good enough. I can't even work with this population. And they pretty much said, like, until you can get yourself under control, you're not going to see any clients with trauma, which in community mental health is no one.
Right.
It was, and I just remember feeling, I learned very early on that supervision is not the place to talk about how I'm responding to clients and how they're triggering me. Because I was already in my own therapy. So I was really confused and so instead of going head on into it with me, like why and how do we take care of ourselves when it happens, I got shamed. I felt like I was the only one that this happens to. 10 years in, I realized that this is pervasive and that everybody goes through that at some point. And there's like very real ways that you could take care of it and prevent it. But hell if I ever knew that.
Well, and this is really where so much of what supervision has become, and how we don't actually parallel the process of what happens with the therapist and the client. It's supervision is now between the supervisor and the therapist. Is that it's become administrative and it's become tactical. And it's not in the ways that we know that psychology works, which is supporting people. And I'm a huge fan of the supervision model called person of the therapist. And it's developing the person to bring their aspects of whatever backgrounds that they have into the therapeutic room, and not necessarily going for perfection, because we're not a medical field that has a medical model that every intervention is going to work from every therapist and with every client, but really doing what the goal of therapy is, which is being able to maximize what the client is getting out of it, and being able to maximize what the therapist trainee is getting out of it, or the therapist associate. And we have a blog article that came out this morning, literally over at Modern Therapist Survival Guide, on just kind of how this system of therapy doesn't actually use therapeutic principles in treating our workforce. And this translates down to clients, because if therapists are afraid to be vulnerable, not necessarily even just in session, clients pick up on this, and they pick up on, there's a reason that I'm owning my privileges as a white cisgendered heterosexual male. It's like, okay, know where I'm coming from in this, and I'll accept that, yeah, I've got some limited experiences and limited worldviews because of what my privileges are. That opens the conversation as far as making that a safer place to be like, okay, hey, white guy, like, here's something you might not know about me, as opposed to just like, well, I don't want to sit there and have to over-explain what it's like to be a female person of color. Like, this is really where we have to be okay within our therapy profession of expressing this kind of stuff, so that way it's okay for clients to continue to expressing this stuff.
Yes. I just everything you said. I already read your guys' blog post, and I was like, yes. Like, yes, you guys are so on point. And it's something I'm really passionate about too. I know you guys know that I'm working, I want to make trauma-informed systems where we're basically taking those trauma-informed principles that we use with clients and applying them to the workforce, because we're not going to start seeing good results with clients, I think, in any field, unless we start treating people with the human dignity that they deserve, which is really what trauma-informed care is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Woo! That was a lot. You dropped some truth right there. And I was just thinking, when the times that I've been able to be vulnerable in a session and say, these are the groups that I belong to, and this is where I hold privilege, and just visually, like, we both know that we're different, and I obviously belong to groups you don't belong to, and I hold privileges that you don't, and I know that that can impact this relationship. Like you said, just bringing it into the room gives your client space to be like, you know what, you're right. I'm this, and this, and you have no idea what that's like. And it gives us a chance to be like, you're totally right. And, I'm wondering, because for me, when I have those conversations, I have more difficult times talking about it with some groups than different other groups. So for me, as a white female, I really struggle talking about my privilege with African-American or Black females because of white guilt. Like, I carry a lot of white guilt, and although I'm trying to get through it, it's still very difficult for me. And so I find myself waiting longer before I have those conversations. And I'm wondering, is there any group for you where you feel like that?
It's a great question, and I'm going to talk through my thoughts as I get to a destination. So I don't know where I'm going with this yet, but I think, really I'm in kind of a privileged place now where my practices are based in wealthier areas of Los Angeles. So a lot of times I'm trying to bring up these kinds of questions in the initial phone call. I also work with teenagers, so a lot of times I'm talking with parents first as opposed to with clients. But I try to make it a habit to bring these kinds of things up. A few months ago, I had a Black family call me because their son was getting bullied racially at his school. And during the phone call, I said, hey, is he going to be okay talking about this with a white guy? Like, this is very obviously something. And the parent said, just the fact that you're asking kind of puts you ahead of a lot of other therapists that we've talked to. I run into this sometimes in talking to parents of teenagers who, are bringing in their teenage daughter, because not every teenage girl is going to feel completely open talking to a guy in his 30s about the things that go on in high schools and middle schools with girls.
Yeah.
I think it took a while for me to get comfortable with this and not being afraid of being rejected because I don't check a box for a client. And I think that once I really found that I can bring that question up sooner, the clients seem to appreciate that more. The only one that I've maybe consistently, and I'm okay with this rejection, is a lot of people still see me as pretty young, but working with clients who are in the geriatric population, seemingly, I'm not going to magically be able to be 25, 35 years older just on a phone call, but, it's, again, something that I still bring up. But I don't know that there's something that when I get that initial intake, that initial phone call, that I'm really trying to be forthcoming about where my privilege is or about where I might see these kinds of things come up, because I've worked in a variety of different populations at this point. So I don't know that I'm afraid. And I think it was, not necessarily identifying what my privilege was before, but I was afraid of being rejected because of that. And with maturity in our field, again, it's okay, because if that's what the client's really not going to identify with, then you're not serving either one of you in that relationship.
Yeah, and I like that you bring up a lot of this, because now you triggered in me. Like, now I'm thinking about myself and the difficulty I've had. It is a bit about rejection. Like, I don't want to be rejected because I'm a member of this other group that is oppressing, and I don't want to be. I also have a lot of issues with associating myself with my group, right? Like, I don't know. I hope there's not a lot of people from Orange County, California, but I'm always like, ooh, Orange County people, right? Because for me, I'm thinking, like, I don't identify with that group of people. I don't identify with those people, those kind of white people, And so I find myself feeling like I'm not like them. Like, don't group me with them, because that's not who I am. But at the same time, recognizing that's partly about rejection, but also recognizing, like, I still am a part of them, no matter how much I'd like to say I'm not. I experience a lot of the privileges that they experience. I'm an upper middle class white female. I went to private schools. I went straight through school. I did work, but it wasn't because I had to work. It was because I wanted to work. Very different, right? My dad was a business owner. Like, I've been exposed to things that other groups don't have the privilege of being exposed to. Mm-hmm. And so as much as I'd like to say I'm not a part of that group, I'm very much a part of that group.
And, this is where, if we look historically, and, I minored in sociology in my undergrad. So even being able to look sociologically at some of these things is, I keep coming back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail and talking about that the problem isn't the absolute racists, it's kind of the moderate whites who aren't doing anything. And I think in being able to identify where we come from moves us out of that moderate place, because we're at least recognizing that plays into the system, that plays into where we're at, and makes us at least somewhat activated towards making changes. And this is going to fit towards any group that identifies as being oppressed in some way, with not just racially, but something socioeconomically, that, working in inner cities before, of just, being able to say, like, hey, I'm a white guy who lives in the suburbs. I don't know what it's like. I notice the police presence around here way more than around my house. That's got to affect you somehow. Like, this is really things where any ways that you can bring things up that are going to be limiting factors of understanding what someone's identity is and how multiple identities come together is really going to be beneficial for the client, because they're at least going to know or make a good guess of what you don't know. And that provides a lot better space than kind of even this, it's kind of this passe identity of like, well, I don't see race. Well, that's part of that moderate, not active group of ignoring how these kinds of things affect somebody coming into their lives.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, when you're looking at, have you ever had the chance or the opportunity to ask a client about how they perceive like your privilege interacting in the therapy room?
All the time. I'm a very open therapist about a lot of things, and out of context, when I tell people that I talk a lot about myself in therapy, they think that it's me projecting my life onto my clients. But anybody who really works with people and understands things is like, hey, what do you think about me being a white guy? Well, X, Y, and Z, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes it's a bitter pill to swallow as far as what I'm coming into my reaction with. And a lot of times I have to tell clients, like, whatever you have to say, I can handle. Or if I can't, I'm going to go to my own therapy and go work on that to better serve you. But I think that in this move overall towards feedback-informed treatment that therapy is really starting to embrace and be able to implement in better ways, is it takes being able to hear what clients have to say about us and being able to react and respond to them in a way that is supportive to their worldview, in a way to their vantage point. And so sometimes, yeah, this privilege definitely comes up. I brought up, being able to talk with this middle schooler about being bullied about, his hair, and about, not being black enough, and any of these kinds of things that after a couple of sessions, the parents called me up and like, we never would have thought that you would be able to unfold the kind of cultural conversations that he's coming to us with now. And, this is really empowering, but it starts from that place of, hey, how do you feel about me being different? And I'm going to support what you have to say no matter what.
Yeah. And how much of you, okay, so this is another question, because I know you work with a lot of pre-licensed and you teach, and how do you start working with clinicians early on to start recognizing that the not personalizing what their clients bring in, especially regarding privilege and bias? Because I think, like you said, it takes a therapist to be, one, very comfortable with who they are, and two, very comfortable with dealing with the feelings being brought into therapy, no matter how they make us feel, or like you said, a bitter pill to swallow. So how do you see training early on clinicians in how to deal with these conversations?
So one of the most powerful continuing education workshops that I ever went to was 6 hours on focusing on how to respond when therapy goes bad. And a large part of it was just being able to role play of when therapy starts to break down, therapy's over. You're no longer, able to really, well, let me move to my next CBT goal because that one's not working right now. So let's go to this other checklist, I'm not just going to crap on CBT, but and so where's this coming from but the workshop really focused on being able to respond in a relationship, not in therapy. And it takes a lot of practice when you don't accept what people say and respond to their feelings behind things, that we really need to focus a lot more on teaching early career therapists. And so I bring some of these aspects into the classes that I teach and a lot of the supervision. It's just like, your job is to be able to think on your feet and respond to the feeling that's there, as opposed to what your personal reaction is. And working with therapists from early parts of their career really helps them to become a lot more responsive and own a lot more of themselves very early on. And so we'll role play. And with the experiences that I have in my career, I can be a difficult client of any kind of caliber in order to bring these into role plays. And then to be able to process after these role plays of, what did this bring up to you? What did this make you want to do? Why did you respond in this way? And really getting them to think through things in real time, but making it personal to make them better professionals.
I share some of that. When I was supervising, I think a big obstacle for some of the therapists was getting really in touch with themselves, getting in touch with their own experiences and their own trauma, and understanding how they're bringing all of that into a room with them, and that clients, without speaking, understand what's being brought into the room. And a lot of struggle within supervision is getting clinicians to feel comfortable enough to start making the connections without feeling guilt and shame. I see it like a lot of guilt and shame coming in, like I'm being affected by this client, or I have this feeling about something they said, and like a lot of shame around having any kind of feelings. And I'm wondering, do you think that's because traditionally we've been being taught that we should be like these cold,
perfect therapists that need to know everything or to blame the client if it's something that we don't know? And we really can't do that, because as humans, we're going to make about 5 or 6 snap judgments about people when we interact with them within the first microseconds. We're going to make a judgment about what somebody's age is. We're going to make a judgment about what they ethnically look like, what their body shape and size is, their socioeconomic status. These are all things that are ingrained into people to make these judgments. And, really easy way to think about this is, if you're driving down the street and you pull up to a stoplight and you look over in the car next to you, you're making all of these judgments about the person next to you. And plus their driving ability. And then this is where, stereotypes are going to come in and all of this kind of stuff. But I'll steer this away from driving ability, but if you see the person in the car next to you eating, if they are a physically fit person, you're going to say, that's a busy person who's hungry. But if they're overweight, you're going to say, that fat person, just can't help themselves. And you're making these kinds of implicit judgments. Now, the same thing happens when people walk into the therapy room. And it's about you. It's about the decor of your office. It's about where your office is located. And so there's all of these kinds of messages that are being sent that clients are going to respond to, that are snap judgments that you largely don't have a ton of control over, but you're feeding into everything that the client believes about these kinds of systems and about these kinds of categories. Plus, now you bring in your personal history, and it's the way that you speak. Do you sound educated? Do you use slang? Do you really, provide an energy in the room that is going to be confrontive to the client who's there? I recognize, for me, working with clients with trauma, especially women of trauma, that I've had clients express that I'm really glad that your office is big, so that way you're not sitting right next to me when I'm talking about sexual trauma. And, this is all the kinds of messages that really go along, but needing to own how your aspects come into the room and the effects that that's going to have on somebody and their trauma, their history, and the reasons that they're seeking out services in the first place.
Yes. So Curt, you are a part of the Therapy Reimagined conference. And I'm wondering, how are some of these topics, are you guys integrating some of these topics? I know that social justice is a piece of the conference. And I'm curious, how are you guys going to be bringing this into that?
So many of our goals as Therapy Reimagined and our conference and our podcast, The Modern Therapist Survival Guide, really is about social justice starts from looking within. And being able to own who you are, own how not only therapy affects you, but you affect therapy. That you are not going to be the perfect therapist for everybody, and that's okay. And that's actually better for both the clients who are seeking things out and for you. And that as you continue to work on yourself and you continue to identify how you impact the relationships and how you represent therapy out to the world is something that is making it okay for people to talk about mental health. And the better that we can own who we are, the better that clients and the general population are going to talk positively about therapy. That we it's when we ignore these kinds of things that people end up with bad therapy experiences, and then they don't seek out mental health. And that's when they end up with lifelong inabilities to cope with their traumas, their stresses, and whatever else is going on with them. So we really make a key point of our programming to deal with identifying your role of yourself in therapy, identifying how the systems affect the way that clients seek out therapy, and really pressuring the leadership of agencies and the professional associations to be representative of everybody. Last year in our inaugural conference, about a third of our presenters were faculty of color. Over half of our presenters were women. I think about 10% were openly LGBTQ+. So we really made an effort to be representative of therapy comes in all shapes, sizes, colors. And we started hearing from other conferences of we kind of need to match what Therapy Reimagined's doing. And it was really surprising to hear this because it wasn't that hard to find qualified people from various backgrounds to be smart professionals in teaching other professionals. And we're starting to see these ripple effects across other conferences of trying to really match these diversity needs. And that's what we're considering successful, is that we're starting to have an impact outside of just the direct things that we're doing. And we see that as a general positive.
Absolutely. I know as a female, seeing conferences where there's a larger number of just women presenting is a huge deal. I see a lot of conferences, and I've spoken at a lot of conferences where it's still 90% men. I've gone to therapy conferences where most of the speakers are men, despite our profession being like more than half women.
Mm-hmm. And this speaks to kind of part of our problem as a field overall is, at least, broad strokes here, but at least up until the 60s, therapy was white, male, rich doctors.
Yeah.
And, as the field expanded and really started to embrace a lot more women, a lot more minorities of all different backgrounds, is that the forefathers of our field, the ones who started it, are still the rich white doctors. Some of them are still around, and that's why they're presenting, is because they're the ones who started things. But as a field, we don't necessarily look at, you don't need 50 years in a research lab in order to be an expert on something. That if people are coming out with something that works for smaller subsets of the population, just because they're young doesn't mean that they don't know anything. And we, as much as we fight against hierarchies for our clients, we're still a very hierarchical profession of needing to listen to the doctorate over the master's level clinician because they went to school longer. Yeah. And despite knowing that when it comes to client outcomes, there's virtually no difference in overall client outcomes for therapists who actually apply principles of good therapy. So we are just as guilty within our field of embracing the hierarchy as we are in, perpetuating it and, being hypocrites and talking with our clients about, hey, that's just a hierarchy.
So you bring up a good point. And yesterday I went on this mission, and I literally took from my zip code every therapist, and I put them into an Excel sheet without their names. I put them into an Excel sheet because I'm a nerd, and I put insurance, non-insurance. I put their fee and their years of experience. And so what I found was astounding. Male therapists generally charged higher fees.
Sure.
Female therapists, depending on their experience. So like female therapists with more 30 years of experience seem to be more likely to charge a rate that any male might charge. Another astounding thing is that males who were like a part of a minority group charged even lower than females, despite how much of experience they had. I mean, I'm talking like people with my experience, 10 years, bilingual, certified and things, charging $90 an hour. And it was exactly kind of like what you're talking. We're still a profession of hierarchy, and And we can even see how privilege and bias is playing out within our own profession.
And I'll add one more thing to this is, and this is something that I've started really tracking, but therapists who got licensed during the recession, so roughly 2008 to 2012, tend to charge lower at the equivalent point in their careers than people who were licensed before, and now we're starting to see the next group afterwards. And it's because of that scarcity mentality when a lot of us were going into business, is that oh, nobody has money, so everybody's sliding their fees down, and we haven't seen the same kind of concurrent jumps in fee raises as even the next people licensed in 2013 to 2017. And so this is, again, intersectionality of understanding time and place of when people are growing up too, and how this can affect, our business practices, but also just kind of where people value themselves. But then you add in females, you add in minorities into this conversation too, and you're going to see even more of these factors come into play.
Yeah, because of I'm just thinking all of the historical trauma experienced by certain groups, of course, like you're talking about just the trauma of what's going on in the economy when we're getting licensed and what's acceptable, what's expected. And I'm just thinking for families and people who have generations of trauma or even financial trauma or cultural trauma, how that's going to affect how they view themselves, how valuable they are, and how they run their business. Yeah, I mean, this topic, I think you could probably talk about for hours and hours and hours. But thank you for chatting with me. I'm going to